Working as a caretaker at the Old Town Cemetery was just a way to make a living for me. I never believed in superstitions or urban legends, despite knowing that many avoided the place after dark. The cemetery, with its weathered tombstones and abandoned mausoleums, always seemed like a quiet place to me. However, everything changed on an autumn night. It was cold and windy as I started my final round of the day. Dry leaves rustled along the ground, creating an unsettling sound. As I walked among the graves, I noticed something strange. Small rodents, more numerous than usual, were scurrying back and forth, going in and out of a narrow tunnel partially hidden behind an old gravestone. Curiosity piqued, I decided to investigate. I followed the rats, who seemed strangely focused on that tunnel. As I approached, a chill ran down my spine, as if the air around me had suddenly turned colder. The entrance to the tunnel was small, with a tight, dark space that seemed to stretch endlessly. Shining my flashlight into the tunnel, I saw something that made me freeze in place. At the far end, where the light barely reached, a crawling figure emerged. It wasn't a rat, but something undefined, slithering along the ground. The creature was shrouded in shadows, but what truly terrified me were the eyes. Two bright, almost incandescent points, glaring through the darkness straight at me. The eyes didn't blink, they simply emitted a cold, intense light. My breathing quickened, and a primal fear gripped me. The creature exuded a disturbing presence, as if it were an ancient and forgotten being that should not be disturbed. The rats around the tunnel's entrance began to squeak frantically, as if alerting to some danger. I felt an urgent need to flee, but at the same time, a fascination with the unknown kept me rooted to the spot. The creature didn't move beyond the shadows, but the sensation of being watched and analyzed by those glowing eyes was overwhelming. There was an energy there, something malevolent and ancient, that made me realize I shouldn't be there. Suddenly, the light from the eyes vanished, and the creature disappeared into the darkness. The rats, as if released from a trance, quickly scattered. I regained control of my body and turned, running as fast as I could away from the tunnel. My heart pounded wildly and panic drove me to leave the cemetery. That night, I barely slept. The images of the glowing eyes and the crawling figure continued to haunt my mind. I quit the job the next day, determined never to return to that cemetery. I didn't tell anyone what I saw, fearing that no one would believe me or that they would think I was losing my mind. Rumors of strange activities at the cemetery continue to circulate, but few dare to investigate. They say that if you go to the cemetery at night, you might see the rats emerging from their hiding places, drawn to something deep within the dark tunnels. And if you look deep into the darkness, you might see those same glowing eyes watching, waiting. About 6 months ago, a new neighbor moved into the apartment next to mine. I live in a relatively quiet building, in a city where people generally don't bother getting to know their neighbors. But I quickly realized that this new tenant was different, in a strange way. From the beginning, he was extremely reserved. I never heard loud music, conversations, or anything that indicated someone actually lived there. As time went by, I started noticing strange things. Sometimes at night I heard faint noises, like whispers or scratching, coming from the shared wall between our apartments. At first I thought it was my imagination, or maybe the building's plumbing, but the sounds continued, always around midnight. The absolute silence during the day made it all the more eerie. I decided to ask other residents about the mysterious neighbor, but to my surprise, no one seemed to know anything about him. One of the doormen even mentioned that he couldn't remember seeing anyone move into that apartment. This only heightened my curiosity, and I have to admit, a bit of fear as well. One night, after another series of whispers and scratches, I decided to take action. The next day, I went to the apartment next door. I knocked a few times, but, as expected, there was no response. Then, on impulse, I tried turning the doorknob. To my surprise, the door wasn't locked, and with a slight push, it creaked open slowly, as if it hadn't been used in years. I entered cautiously, my heart racing. The apartment was completely empty. There were no furniture or signs that anyone had recently lived there. The floor was covered in a thin layer of dust, as if no one had stepped inside for a long time. The air was thick and heavy, giving the impression that time had stopped in that place. Panic started to set in, but I continued exploring. In the corner of one of the rooms, I found an old cardboard box. Inside, there were old documents and photos of a person who seemed to be the former tenant. But the most shocking discovery was an eviction notice, revealing that the last resident had disappeared over 10 years ago, and the apartment had been vacant ever since. I quickly left the apartment, my heart pounding. I closed the door behind me and went back to my place, trying to understand what had just happened. Since that day, I never heard the whispers or scratching again. It seems that somehow, the mystery of the silent neighbor had been resolved, but to this day, I avoid thinking too much about what really happened. It was one of those nights where silence and darkness seemed to dominate everything. I was driving back home after a long business trip, cruising along a deserted highway. The only lights came from my car's headlights and the occasional distant sign. I was completely alone on that road, or at least, that's what I thought. As I continued down the dark asphalt, I spotted a figure on the side of the road, thumb out, hitchhiking. It was an unusual sight, especially in such a remote area. Without thinking much, I decided to stop. Maybe out of curiosity, maybe out of fatigue, who knows. The man was tall, wearing a long coat, and had an intense gaze that made me uneasy. Even so, I opened the car door. "Thanks for stopping," he said as he got in and shut the door. His voice was calm, but there was something about it that sent chills down my spine. We started chatting about mundane things, the weather, the long road, travel fatigue, until he made a comment that caught me off guard. "It's always good to come home after a work trip," he said. "Sometimes you need a break to reflect on what's important." I agreed, still confused about the nature of the conversation. He seemed to understand the exhaustion I felt, as if he knew exactly what was going through my mind. He continued to speak, mentioning how some people find clarity in solitude, and how journeys can be opportunities for introspection. The casual tone of his voice made it seem like he was just philosophizing, but his words resonated with my own thoughts, as if he were describing my reflections during the trip. The conversation became stranger when he made a comment about defining moments and how facing hard truths can be challenging, but necessary. A shiver ran down my spine. It was a generic observation, but it reminded me of personal issues I had been avoiding confronting. I looked at him, trying to discern if there was more to his words, but he just gazed serenely at the road. As we drove on, the sense of discomfort grew. He spoke vaguely about incidents that shape us and how things don't always go as planned, but we have to move on. It all sounded somewhat philosophical, but each sentence seemed loaded with a strange familiarity. I started feeling exposed, as if he knew more than he was letting on. Then, near the end of the ride, he mentioned something that left me completely perplexed. "I hope your wife is doing well. She must be eager to see you." He said this casually, but I didn't recall mentioning that I was married, let alone her name. My heart raced. "How do you know her name?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He turned to me with an enigmatic smile. "You must be tired. I don't think I mentioned that," he said, brushing off the question as if it were a joke. But the way he spoke made me question my own sanity. Did he actually say it, or was I just imagining things? Shortly after, he asked to be let out. "You can drop me off here," he said, pointing to an empty stretch of road. Relieved and confused, I pulled over. He stepped out calmly, turned to me and said, "Sometimes the mind plays tricks. Good luck with your thoughts." I shut the door and continued on, still shaken. I looked in the rearview mirror and saw nothing, as if he had never been there. I kept driving, trying to process what had happened. When I finally got home, I felt relieved, but the encounter with that stranger still haunts me. To this day, I don't know who he was, or if everything really happened the way I remember. All I know is that since that night, I avoid picking up hitchhikers on the road. When I was a child, my family moved into an old house in a quiet neighborhood. My parents were excited about the opportunity to renovate the place, which had a vintage charm and plenty of space for all of us. However, from the very beginning, I felt something strange. There was a constant chill in the air even on the warmest days, and the house seemed darker than it should be, as if it absorbed the sunlight. The first week was uneventful as we unpacked and settled into our new surroundings. But soon, strange things began to happen. It started with small noises at night, like someone walking down the hallway. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, or my parents being up late. But when I asked them, they all said they hadn't left their rooms. Things got stranger when objects started moving around. I remember one day I left my toys on the floor in my room, and when I came back from school, they were stacked neatly in the corner. My parents insisted they hadn't touched them, and my younger brother was too small to have done it. This left us puzzled, but we tried to brush it off, thinking we were simply forgetting where we had placed things. One night I woke up to the sound of whispering. It was a low, indistinct murmur like someone was talking in another room. I got out of bed and followed the sound to the basement, where the whispers seemed to be coming from. The basement was a place we rarely went, as it was damp and dark. I cautiously opened the door, and as soon as I turned on the light, the whispering stopped. I looked around but saw nothing unusual, just old boxes and dusty furniture. I went back to bed confused and a little scared. The following days brought more strange occurrences. The lights would flicker constantly, and the electricity seemed to have a mind of its own. Once, while we were having dinner, the TV turned on by itself, displaying static. My dad tried to turn it off, but the power button wouldn't work. It only stopped after he unplugged the TV. That's when my parents started to take what was happening seriously. We decided to look into the history of the house. Talking to some of the older neighbors, we found out that the house had a sinister reputation. They said the previous owner was a reclusive and eccentric man who had died in the house under mysterious circumstances. Some spoke of strange rituals and that he dabbled in things better left alone. There were no official records to confirm these stories, but it was enough to alarm us. One night, as my parents discussed the rumors in the living room, the topic of rituals and the former owner came up. It was the first time my parents expressed their fear that the house might actually be haunted. They decided it was time to sell the place and move out as soon as possible. But before we could leave, something happened. It was a stormy night, and the wind howled outside. The lights flickered, and we all sat in the living room, trying to stay calm. Suddenly, we heard a loud bang from the basement. My dad grabbed a flashlight and went to investigate, with my mom and me following close behind. When he opened the basement door, we saw something we would never forget. The boxes were overturned, and a message was scratched into the wall as if with something sharp. "You are not welcome here." We left the house the next morning and never went back. My parents sold the house at a loss, just happy to be rid of it. We never found out what really happened there or if the stories about the former owner were true. All I know is that, to this day, I get chills when I think about that house. To us, it will always be known as the haunted house.
Working the night shift at the hospital has its challenges, but it's something I've grown to appreciate. The quietness of the night offers a certain peace, even when there are emergencies to attend to. On that particular night, the atmosphere was especially calm. The occasional sound of machines monitoring patients and the soft hum of fluorescent lights were my only companions as I made my rounds. Around 2 in the morning, the intercom from room 307 buzzed, interrupting my moment of calm. The voice on the other end was weak, almost a whisper, but there was an urgency in the tone. "Nurse, can you come here? I'm in a lot of pain, and it's so dark." I recognized the voice as Mr. Johnson's, an elderly patient who had been admitted a few weeks earlier. I went to his room and found him lying in bed, restless. His eyes, large and expressive, reflected discomfort and a fear I couldn't quite understand. The lights in the room were appropriately adjusted. It wasn't any darker than usual. I tried to comfort him, adjusting his pillow and administering the prescribed pain relief. He mumbled something about the darkness and winced in pain. "It's all right, Mr. Johnson. I'll stay here until you feel better," I said, holding his hand. He slowly closed his eyes, and his breathing began to steady. I stayed with him for a few more minutes, until he seemed to fall asleep. I left the room quietly, trying not to make any noise. Around 4 a.m, the intercom buzzed again. It was Mr. Johnson, once more complaining of pain and saying it was dark. I found it strange since the room was as lit as usual. I returned to room 307 where he was visibly agitated, repeating that he was in a lot of pain and everything seemed dark around him. I checked his vitals and gave him another dose of pain relief, doing my best to comfort him. He gripped my hand with surprising strength for someone so frail. "Please don't leave me alone. It's so dark," he whispered, his voice almost childlike. I promised to stay nearby and talked to him about everyday things, trying to distract him. Eventually, he seemed to calm down and went back to sleep. I finished my shift, and the next morning, returned to the ward to check on Mr. Johnson before heading home. When I arrived at room 307, to my surprise, it was empty. The bed was made, and there was no sign that anyone had been there the night before. Confused, I went to the nurse's station and asked a colleague, "What happened to Mr. Johnson? Was he transferred?" My colleague, not noticing anything unusual, replied calmly, "Oh, Mr. Johnson. He finally found peace. He passed away 3 days ago." I stood there, stunned, shock and disbelief washing over me. The nurse looked at me with a mix of surprise and understanding. "You know, sometimes patients leave something behind, something that keeps them here longer than they should. Maybe he just needed someone to talk to help him find his way." I left the hospital that morning with a sense of surrealness, questioning everything I believed about life and death. That night, something happened that defies any rational explanation. An experience that made me believe that, in some way, Mr. Johnson was caught between this world and the next, seeking comfort in his final hours. To this day, when I think about that night, a chill runs down my spine. I don't know what really happened, but I'll never see the night shift the same way again. Something changed in me, a certainty that even after death, there may still be something that connects the dead to the living, something we may never fully understand.
You've just ventured into the shadows of the unknown. If you enjoyed this terrifying journey, don't forget to subscribe to our channel, Whispers from the Abyss, Tales of Terror. Hit the notification bell so you never miss a dark tale. We want to hear your theories and fears in the comments below. Leave a like if this story sent chills down your spine. Join us and become part of this brave community that faces terror head on. Until the next cold, dark night.